Take a look at this. Far out in the grey water, halfway between Orkney and Shetland, on its own, miles from any other land, there is a single small island barely 3 miles long. It is the most remote inhabited island in all of Britain. About 50 people live here. There is one shop, one school with fewer than 5 children in it, no pub, no streetlights. The ferry that connects it to the world is so small, and the sea around it so rough, that the passenger seats have seatbelts. You have almost certainly never set foot on this island. And yet there is a very good chance that you have worn its name, because a pattern first knitted on this lonely rock traveled all the way around the world. But long before the sweaters, on a September night in 1588, the most powerful warship of the greatest fleet on Earth was driven onto these cliffs in the dark. And 300 desperate men found themselves entirely at the mercy of a few dozen of the poorest people in Britain. Before we dive in, hit subscribe and drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from. When I first found this place on a map, I felt something I didn't expect. Because this tiny forgotten rock, this place almost nobody visits, has been standing at a crossroads of history for 1,000 years. Vikings used it as a signal station. 100 ships have died on its rocks. And on one of those wrecks hangs a story about mercy and betrayal that I have not been able to stop thinking about since. This is Fair Isle. And this is the story of how the poorest people in Britain showed kindness to their enemies and what the powerful did to repay it. First, that name you already know. For centuries, the women of Fair Isle knitted. On a treeless island with almost no way to make money, wool was survival, and the islanders became famous for a particular style of knitting, bands of small, intricate geometric patterns in the natural browns and grays and whites of the sheep. They knitted so well that they used their jumpers as money, bartering them with passing ships for the supplies the island could not grow. And then, in the 1920s, a painter showed the Prince of Wales wearing one, and the whole world wanted a Fair Isle sweater. Today you can buy an imitation in almost any country on Earth. The name of this island of 50 people is stitched into wardrobes across the planet. Almost nobody who wears it knows that it is a real place, or how nearly it vanished. To understand that, we have to go back to 1588. That summer, the King of Spain launched the Armada, the greatest fleet the world had ever seen, to invade England. It failed. Beaten in the Channel and scattered by storms, the surviving Spanish ships were forced to flee home the long way, in a great desperate loop north around the top of Scotland and back down past Ireland. It was a graveyard of a route, and one of those ships was called Gran Grifón, the Great Griffin, the flagship of the fleet's supply squadron. She was leaking, half-wrecked, and carrying far too many men, nearly 300 crew and soldiers crammed aboard. We know what those last hours were like, because one of the men on board kept a diary, and it survived. He writes of a sea so wild that, in his words, it was as if it filled the sky. He describes the ship filling with water, the men beyond exhaustion, nearly 300 of them so broken by fear that they didn't lift a finger, and simply called out to the Virgin Mary, certain that their lives were now at an end. Just sit with that for a second. 300 men, thousands of miles from home, in the black of a northern night, feeling their ship come apart beneath them, and praying to die well. And then, out of the dark, they saw land. On the 27th of September, 1588, the Gran Grifón was driven into a narrow, rocky cleft on the southeast coast of Fair Isle, a place called Strom's Helier. The ship jammed against the cliffs and began to break up, and the men climbed the masts and threw themselves onto the rocks. And against every expectation, most of them lived. Now imagine it from the other side. Imagine you are one of a few dozen crofters on the loneliest island in Britain. It is the edge of winter, and overnight 300 foreign soldiers, enemy soldiers, from the very fleet sent to invade your country, come crawling up out of the sea onto your shore. They are armed. They outnumber you many times over. You have barely enough food on this rock to feed your own families through the winter, let alone 300 strangers. The islanders took them in. For about 6 weeks, this handful of the poorest people in Britain sheltered and fed 300 shipwrecked enemies. They shared what little they had on an island that grew almost nothing. It could not have been easy, and it could not have been safe, but they did it. And the Spanish, by the accounts that survive, behaved in return like perfect gentlemen, grateful guests of the people whose country they had come to conquer. For 6 weeks, on a rock at the end of the world, the war simply stopped. Eventually, the island's owner arranged for the survivors to be taken off to the Scottish mainland, and then on to Edinburgh, and at last they were allowed to sail for home. And here is where the story turns, and where it has haunted me. Before they left, Queen Elizabeth I of England gave her word that they would not be harmed, that no English ship would attack them on their way back to Spain, and that promise was a trap made of words. Because Elizabeth had promised only that English ships would leave them alone, she said nothing about anyone else, and then she quietly sent word to the Dutch, England's allies and Spain's bitter enemies, telling them exactly when and where these ships would be sailing. The Dutch gunships were waiting. The men of the Gran Grifón, who had survived the Channel, survived the storms, survived the wreck, and survived the winter because a few dozen poor islanders chose to be kind to them, were attacked at sea on the way home. Half of them never reached Spain. Think about the shape of that. The mightiest empire on earth was wrecked on the smallest island in Britain, and it was saved by the mercy of people who had almost nothing. And the crown that promised those men safety used the letter of its promise to arrange their deaths. The kindness came from the bottom. The betrayal came from the top. The wreck itself lay on the seabed at Strom's Helier for nearly 400 years, until divers found it in 1970. And when they raised the guns of the Gran Grifón, they discovered something sad and telling. Almost half of the ship's heaviest cannon had never even been fired. The greatest warship of the greatest fleet in the world had gone to its death on Fair Isle with its guns still loaded, never getting the chance to use them. But the island's own story was far from over, because Fair Isle spent the next 3 centuries slowly fighting to survive it all. Life here was hard in a way that is difficult to imagine now. In 1701, a sickness came ashore, smallpox, and swept through the island, and many of the people simply did not survive it. The landlords were harsh, the crofts were overcrowded, and the sea took ship after ship on the rocks. For the people of Fair Isle, survival was never certain from one winter to the next. And then, in 1862, came the quietest kind of ending. The island's poorest families, 65 adults and 70 children, were gathered up and shipped away, across the Atlantic to Canada, to start again in a place called New Brunswick. It was dressed up as charity, as help for the destitute, but historians who have studied it since have concluded it was really something colder. It was the removal of families the landlords no longer wanted on their land. 135 people, most of them children, carried off Fair Isle to another continent and told it was for their own good. The island bled people for another 100 years. 400 islanders at the start of the 20th century became 300, then 200, then, by the 1950s, only about 50, and everyone could see where that line was heading. Fair Isle was about to become another St. Kilda, another island evacuated and left empty to the birds and the wind. And then one man saved it. Not a lord, not a government, a bird watcher. His name was George Waterston, an ornithologist from Edinburgh who had fallen in love with Fair Isle before the war. When the Second World War came, he went to fight, and in 1941 he was captured at the Battle of Crete and taken to a prisoner of war camp in Germany. And to keep himself sane through 30 months of captivity, George Waterston lay in that camp and planned, in extraordinary detail, a bird observatory he dreamed of building one day on Fair Isle. It was the thing he held on to. When he finally fell too ill to be kept prisoner and was sent home in 1943, exhausted and sick, the ship carried him back toward Britain. And by a coincidence so perfect it feels invented, the very first piece of British soil he saw rising out of the sea was Sheep Rock, Fair Isle. The island he had been dreaming of, waiting for him at the end of the war. He did not forget. In 1948, George Waterston bought Fair Isle, and he built his observatory, and he gave the dying island something it had not had in a century, a reason for the outside world to come. Birdwatchers arrived. Money came with them, and a few years later he handed the whole island to the National Trust for Scotland, which finally stopped the bleeding and held the community together. The evacuation never came. Fair Isle lived. Today, about 50 people still live out there on the loneliest inhabited rock in Britain. They still knit the pattern that carries the island's name around the world. Birds still pour through every spring and autumn, and the observers still count them. The island that the Armada was wrecked on, that smallpox nearly emptied, that the landlords tried to clear, that came within a handful of people of disappearing forever, is still there. Sometimes the smallest places hold the biggest stories. This one rock, 3 miles long, at the crossroads of the Northern Sea, holds the wreck of the greatest fleet in the world, and the memory of a few poor families who fed 300 of their enemies through a winter. It holds a betrayal by a queen, and a rescue by a prisoner of war, and a pattern of little colored squares that outsailed every ship that ever passed it, Almost nobody who wears its name will ever go there. But the island is still standing at the edge of everything, exactly where it has always been. If you've ever heard of Fair Isle, or worn the pattern, or seen it out on the water between Orkney and Shetland, let me know in the comments, and let me know where I should go next. See you in the next one.